The Untold Adventures of Biao. Season 1, Episode 20. At the grave, Mr. Gong and Biao found a few things. They quickly closed the hole and went down the mountain. Along the way, Biao wondered if the items they got were really precious. Mr. Gong cherished the treasure in his hand and explained it to Biao. The sword they had just found was a rare sword. It already had the spirit, which could prevent from being disturbed by the devils. Mr. Gong continued to explain to Biao. Since time immemorial, every weaponsmith wanted to forge a powerful weapon, so they had to spend a lot of time and effort. Forging weapons in the past was complicated, not as quickly as mass production nowadays. Weaponsmiths at that time even used human blood to forge weapons. This helped the things they forged become fierce weapons as soon as it was completed. Then, the weaponsmiths used living things to sacrifice for the weapons to generate spiritual energy, which was fearsome. And he concluded with Biao that this sword was one of those. It was at least forged by human blood. In the past, I also found a sword that was very difficult to control. Now you keep this one. Biao was scared at first. But then, he convinced Mr. Gong to tell the detail of the fearsome weapon because of his curiosity. Mr. Gong recalled that about 8 years ago when Biao was a baby, Mr. Gong and the soul-revoking owl managed to catch a gray demon rat on a wild mountain on a pitch-black night. This rat turned into a demon already, so it was very cunning. After being chased by Mr. Gong here, it hid in a deep cave and did not go out. Mr. Gong and the owl waited outside for a long time, still no movement. The owl stood patiently on the rock in front of the cave. After observing for a while, Mr. Gong used his kunai with the chain, hit the demon's death weakness lightning fast. The demon rat was defeated and it's over. Mr. Gong shared the booty according to the rule. I took the 3 chains of Qingfeng, the blood of the 4th. The body is left to you. After that, Mr. Gong got the 3 chains of Qingfeng and put it in his bag while the soul-revoking owl enjoyed the delicious meal. As soon as Mr. Gong turned his head, he suddenly heard the sound of the owl howling, flying toward Mr. Gong, then veered in another direction. Mr. Gong knew something was wrong and followed the owl. After catching up, the bird was perched on a tree branch. Mr. Gong saw in the darkness ahead a middle-aged man. He was around his 30s and appeared to suicide. This man had lifeless eyes, and his mind seemed to be under control. In his hand, he held a sharp sword close to his throat. Mr. Gong immediately threw the kunai with the chain in his hand. The kunai hit the sword, making a king sound and causing the sword to fall from the man's hand. The sword was thrown about 10 meters away and then fell to the ground. As soon as the sword was released from his hand, the man's mind returned to normal. He trembled with fear and sweating because he discovered that his whole body was full of wounds caused by the dagger. Mr. Gong ran over and took the man's hand, asked what happened. But it seems that this man was not really awake. Furthermore, he was also unaware of what had happened to injure himself to this extent. The man looked around lifelessly, stammering and speechless. It took a while to regain consciousness. Mr. Gong tore the cloth on his body and bandaged the wound. Mr. Gong told the man that he almost suicided due to not controlling his own mind. The man kept holding his head and shouted, "Why am I like this? Why did something like this happen to me?" After a while, as if recalling something, the man began to say, "Everything was because of the sword that sucked human blood." He told Mr. Gong everything. After hearing this, Mr. Gong ran to the sword. He discovered this was an ancient short sword full of killing intent. The other man saw Mr. Gong was no ordinary person. so he told the story of how he got the ancient sword. His name was Juan. A few days ago, he rode a motorbike from the village to go out to work. On the way, he met Mr. Su, who was sitting by the roadside. Juan greeted Mr. Su. Mr. Su greeted back and said that he was waiting for a bus to go to the town to sell some things. As Juan enthusiastically asked, so Mr. Su told him the story. A few days ago, while in the garden, he accidentally dug up a sword. So he would like to sell it for some money and buy seeds. Juan was curious, so he offered to see the sword. Because Mr. Su was free at that time, he quickly agreed. Juan was originally a collector of antiques, so when he heard that Mr. Su wanted to sell his sword, Juan was very excited. Mr. Su carefully unwrapped the blade from the red cloth. Juan was very excited, staring at the sword. Although not very knowledgeable about weapons, Juan recognized that although there was a bit of black rust, the blade still looked extremely sharp and gave off a scary feeling. Juan was moved and offered to buy the sword from Mr. Su. Mr. Su originally planned to sell this knife for money to buy seeds for the new crop. However, Juan asked to buy it, so Mr. Su was slightly embarrassed because he sold things to acquaintances. In the awkward moment, Mr. Su said he wanted to give it to Juan for free. After all, this was something he accidentally got. One wanted to buy, and one wanted to give. They were in the middle of the road, bargained back and forth for half an hour. In the end, Juan tried to put 100 dong in Mr. Su's pocket to buy the old sword. Juan was about to leave when Mr. Su turned back to warn him about the sword. The day this sword was dug up, all the women and children in his house were terrified. Being an old man, he understood that this sword was an evil thing. Because of knowing each other for long, he wanted to warn Juan to be careful. At this time, Juan had bad judgments about Mr. Su. He thought that Mr. Su regretted selling it to him cheaply, so Mr. Su wanted to threaten him like that. Although a little contemptuous of Mr. Su, Juan still replied, "I don't believe in ghost stories, don't worry." The two said goodbye to each other. Mr. Su returned to the village, and Juan continued to ride away. On the way, Juan got a little excited because he accidentally owned an ancient sword. Thinking about the sword made him even more excited. In his heart, he thought that even if there were ghosts, evils, or that the dagger was once stained with blood, the sword was still a treasure. Being in a good mood, he rode faster and faster. At that time, the knife was carried at his waist. He rode fast on the slippery gravel road, so he couldn't control and fell off from the motorbike while turning.